Welcome everyone to Leadership for Society, Race and Power. It's my pleasure today to have Professor Charlton McIlwain. McIlwain?
Close. McIlwain.
McIlwain. I knew I was going to get that wrong. I appreciate the help. He is a professor of media, culture, and communications, and also vice provost for faculty engagement and development at NYU. He's also the author of 2 books, Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice, From the AfroNet to Black Lives Matter, and also Race Appeal, How Political Candidates Invoke Race in U.S. Political Campaigns. Thanks so much for joining us, Charlton.
You're very welcome. It's great to be here with you.
Great. So last time we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. And in that session, they told me that I could show up to work and behave the way I felt, just be myself. So today, I want to jump in and talk about racism. So today I want to think about how racism affects our lives and what exactly that is. So let me start by asking you, how do you think about racism? And more specifically, when you use the word racism or hear the word racism, what do you think? What is racism?
Yeah, that's a good question to start off with, because the term is complicated and people have varying definitions for it. I'll tell you one thing that I don't believe racism is, or the way that I don't like to define it, is to purely think about individual people who do quote unquote racist things, or people who we'd say might believe or think that other people from other racial groups are inferior in some way. But that's a common perception about what racism is. So people have heard, no doubt, the terminology institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism. When I talk about racism, racism for me is all of those 3 things together. And so let me break it down quickly, as clear as I can, and take a stab at that. So when I say institutional or structural racism, I'm talking about the laws, the practices, the policies that govern our everyday lives that produce and reproduce differential access to power, privilege, opportunity, and resources, and that distributes advantages and disadvantages along racial group lines, right? So here's an example. African Americans and other communities of color have significantly less access to quality health care in the US. That is something I would define as institutional systemic racism, right? So this comes from, this lack of access comes from everything from where healthcare institutions are located vis-a-vis large communities and people of color. It comes from historical mistreatment of African Americans and other people of color by healthcare institutions, doctors, nurses, researchers, scientists. So there are many sources of this unequal access, but it is there. So that's an example of what I mean by institutional racism. It is an institution that works differently for some people, and for African Americans and people of color, less well than it does so for whites, right? So if you're still with me, institutional structural racism. I want to talk about one other point, and that's the systemic nature of racism. And when I talk about systemic, that means that racism permeates and connects across institutions, such that the outcomes of racist policies and practices in one institution trigger and sustain those in others. And a good example of this is something I carried from maybe the one thing I remember from my undergrad days. And it was an example about how systems work in thinking about a thermostat, right? A thermostat is a system that regulates temperature. And if we have central air and heat, we go into our thermostat and we program it. We tell it what is our comfortable temperature, what it is that we want, what we're comfortable with, what we desire. We set a temperature, and then that system engages with external things that are happening. I might have the stove on in the kitchen. I may have the front door open. And so temperature ebbs and flows. And so in that case, what does the system try to do? It tries to get me back to that temperature that I've set. Let's say that's 70 degrees. And so it acts and reacts with a particular aim in mind, and that is to get me to a place where I've set and said, this is what I want, this is what I desire, this is what I'm comfortable with. And the same way when we think about systems and racist systems. And so here's the last example, and then I'll shut up on this particular question. Let's think about COVID as a trigger, right? COVID back in March and April, what changed as a result of COVID? Well, number one, the nature of work changed. And so when we think about the institution of work, of labor, of economics, we know that people of color, African Americans and Latinx in particular, were disproportionately part of those that we deemed essential workers. So had to get up, had to, transport themselves to work every day, be in unsafe situations. And as a result, what happened? We found eventually that Black and Latinx folks were disproportionately affected by COVID. And so here we have a move from the labor context and institution to healthcare. What else changed? The nature of education changed. We moved from in-person to remote learning. What effect did that have? It disproportionately affected negatively Black and brown folks. Why? Because of differential access to broadband, to strong technologies that enable people to connect and learn, et cetera. Those things are a result of many different influences, ranging from geography to technological infrastructure and so forth. So simply as a way of saying, when we talk about systems, then we're talking about racism in one institution that triggers, connects across others, all of which set up and work their way into maintaining this sort of status quo of racism, or let's say simply the disparate access to power and privilege and resources.
So it sounds like you're not making any distinction about how these disparate impacts occur, right? So is it, in the way you just described it, is any disparate impact, is any difference in the outcomes of Black folks and white folks and Latinx folks, is that always an indication of racism from your perspective?
From my perspective, yes. And I think that, what people typically want to sort of suggest or ask in this kind of context is, what about the role of the individual, right? Are these simply things that happen, or are people causing them to happen? And, most of the time I simply like to leave individuals out of it, not because individuals don't play a role, but I think we get overly concerned with individual people and thinking, okay, if this person, only a person who is racist themselves can impact and make all of these other kinds of institutional systemic racist practices happen or work or lead to these kinds of disparate outcomes. And so what I'd like to focus on mostly is the outcome rather than motivation or intent of individuals that may or may not drive those particular outcomes.
Yeah, because it seems that things have changed a lot in this country, right? So when people will point to things like the civil rights movement, desegregation, there's been a lot of positive changes. And in your example of the thermostat, you could think about that as where the setting is on the thermostat, I wonder how you think about that. So who sets the thermostat? How do you have a sense of where it's set, if we stay with that metaphor, or is it being set by a group? Like, how do I think about that metaphor in terms of the setting?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's set. I mean, number one, I think we have to take into account history and historical context, right? And so the depths in which race and racism are institutionalized and part of the structure of the U.S. and in some ways even the world comes from history, comes from the sort of founding of the country as a fundamentally racist country who did not see non-white people as fully human, and developed policies and practices that supported and went along with those things. And those things, though they loosened over the years as we moved from slavery to Reconstruction and into civil rights movement and so forth, many of those policies, practices, sentiments, et cetera, the ways we think and view our relationship with non-white people all linger and continue in particular ways. So in one sense, we could talk about historical context as being a driver. And then there are very real senses in which people, decision makers, people who are influential and at the head of major institutions that govern our lives, perpetuate racism in those particular practices and decisions that they make. I like to talk about this, this is kind of the direction that I took in my book, Black Software, which of course looks at race and technology and particularly the origins of that. And that's something that I get into quite a bit there, where it's very clear and laid bare where the origins come from, because they are, when we look back to the early mid-60s and the development, height of the development of computing, the height of the civil rights movement, you see where these two things clash. You see where people made very specific decisions to say, hey, we have new technology, we have new powers of computing here. What problems do we ask them to solve? How do we put these new technologies to work? And some of those first problems were literally the problem of Black people who were out in the streets fighting for their civil rights in many different ways. And the leadership of the country, from the president on down to the heads of major corporations, tech companies, and so forth, who gathered together and said, here's how we can go about using these technologies to solve this particular problem of crime, which was in no uncertain terms a problem of race, and in really clear terms a problem of Blackness at the time. And so I think a confluence of those factors, history and present day workings of people who had institutions that have the power to continue to reproduce and produce anew these sorts of racist structures that lead to very different kinds of outcomes when we look across the spectrum of race.
Hey, great. I was going to ask you about tech, so I'm happy you brought it there. So in the book, the way sometimes it's unclear to me if you think the uses of the tech are problematic and racist, or you think the tools themselves have become problematic and racist. So I guess that's the first question. The tools as they evolved and exist, is it inherent in the tools now, or is it just the use of those tools that you find racist?
Yeah, I don't think they are inherent in the tool. We create an Ethernet cable, we create the idea of computer networking. Those are bits and bytes, hardware, software that may have no race and have no individual motivations, but they do have politics, right? And they have politics in as much as it is human beings who decide what these technologies will be and what interests they will serve. And so I think, one of the points that I really am trying to make in the book is that it's hard to separate the technology purely and simply as it exists from the ways in which we use it. And I think there's only a real sense in which we can come at it and thinking about how we put technology to use. Otherwise, these are just benign things that we have laying around, but we know that that's not the case. It's things that get put to use and technologies that are ostensibly used to solve particular problems. And so a lot of what I talk about and see is what are the problems we ask computers and technologies to solve? And frequently those problems are framed as human beings. A problem of the border that gets framed around people who are illegally, quote unquote, crossing those borders, or people who are said to disproportionately commit crimes. And so when we ask computing and technology and design it to solve particular problems, frequently we don't have an objective problem in mind. We have a perception about who is the source of those problems. And then that technology gets unleashed on them in ways that negatively and devastatingly often affects them from a technological and other senses.
Yeah, that description sounds a little bit more benign the way I read some of your stuff. I'm just going to say that.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like there were two routes you were suggesting. One was exclusion, right? So the understanding what the problems were, that's kind of what you're talking about now, didn't include the representations from people, from Black folks or other people who didn't have a lot of power at the time. So they didn't participate in the development of the tool. So they didn't get to decide what kind of problems we needed to solve. But you also had a discussion where you talked about the committeemen, you had in quotes, the committeemen. And that sounded more like, to me, I read that more as backlash. Like, and you had it, you really focused on kind of at the civil rights movement, there was some things that were changing, and there was a sense in which they were using the tools, the way I read it anyway, to push back against some of the progress that had been made. Is that a fair reading of what you were suggesting?
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair reading. And, you know, I think one of the things in between there is sort of you had Black folks doing what we were doing at that particular time, right? You had those in power, and I'm thinking of, you know, President Johnson, his attorney general, who, you know, I lay the blame mostly there because they are the ones that said, look, we have a problem of crime. And essentially this crime problem has a Black face. And, you know, throughout their report, throughout Johnson's sort of given the mission to his committee, this crime commission, laid out that the problem of crime was really about Black people in urban areas who, for varying reasons, you know, may be legitimate or so forth, but they were really the sources of crime. And so this was the problem that we had to solve. And then when I reach over to my scientific folks, my engineers, and say, I have a problem, then those people then get brought into a situation where they're already designing for something very specific that's already been framed. Tell me how to mitigate this problem that's happening in urban Kansas City or in South Central Los Angeles or the middle of Harlem, right? And so my technology is already being brought into service in a specific relationship and way of thinking about people, Black people, as fundamentally poor, criminal, backward, in no uncertain certain terms. And one of the interesting things about those committeemen were, you know, being charitable, but I think it's also true that they came in saying, look, our tools are just that. They are tools. Can it help you solve your quote unquote quote crime problem? We don't know. We've never tried it before, but this is what you've asked us to do. So we are going to design and build something that satisfies what it is that you've been asking for. And so it wasn't as if those committeemen, you know, we have the picture that they were sinister folks looking out on Black folks saying, we have to push back, but that was the project that they were brought in to design and to build a solution for, and therefore being implicated in what got built and what the implications and aftermath was of that, both immediately in the mid-'60s all the way up through the present, I would argue.
Yeah, I was going to bring it to the present. So you said Black folks were doing what they were doing at the time, which is, I assume what you mean is what is happening right now in the country, that people are upset, people are rioting or expressing frustration in a number of ways. And it's not just Black folks, to be sure, but I'm curious how you think about this playing out right now. So those were examples in the 60s, how it played out. Obviously, tech has continued to evolve. Like, help me think about how this is playing out right now. Who are the committeemen? What does that look like?
Yeah, and you know what? I would say it doesn't look too different when we think about 1965, 1968, and the present. And so I'll bring up this example. This is from maybe 2018, 2019. The investigative journalism outlet, The Intercept, came out with this investigative report that reported on the fact that New York City, or the NYPD, had put in place video analytics into its cameras across the city, and that it shared all that data with IBM because IBM was working on a project that was an AI tool that would be able to identify criminal suspects based on race. So that's the tool that they were building. NYPD was supplying the data for that tool to be built, right? And I remember reading that at the moment because the sort of beyond this, this is happening kind of bombshell, there was a second one, which was for the Intercept saying, this was all happening in secret over the last 5 years. And I kind of chuckled because I said to myself, that's not a 5-year project. This hasn't been going on for 5 years. It's been going on for 50 years. And when I said that, it was not just sort of generally speaking about the relationship between technology companies and public sector agencies. It was about a real ongoing relationship between the NYPD and IBM since the early mid-60s to build these types of surveillance technologies that were set in place in 65 and by 68 started to proliferate across the country that gave the technological tools to profile by race, profile by geography, to do the kinds of predictive policing that are so prevalent in today's situation. And so to bring that up to the present, I think we look right past the uprisings following the summer, the killings of many folks, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others. And it was interesting to see as folks were out in the streets, as folks were pushing back, as folks were clashing against police in very specific and clear ways, what was going on, we started to learn in the days after that. These same facial recognition technologies that were operable, that were identifying suspects, and that police in places like Florida and New York and elsewhere were utilizing to round up folks and question folks and even jail folks based on various aspects of their participation in these actions that happened in Ferguson back in 2014, 2015, all the different things that went on that particular year. So I think not much has changed, and I think not much has changed because we still fundamentally see the same people as problems and see them as problems in some of the very same ways that we always have, that we see Black folks, brown folks as less educated, prone to crime, and all of these kinds of things. And those things shape what technologies we decide we want to design and build and how they, of course, get used.
Yeah, so when you talked about the systematic part, you wanted to say, let's not focus on individuals. But when we get to the present, it's hard for me not to focus on individuals. It looks like some people are out to get me. I'm just going to say, right, when you're doing uprisings, it's not as if everybody is trying to use the technology in that way. So help me think about that, right? It's as things get more intense, it seems to me it becomes easier to focus on particular bad actors, right? These are the people who are keeping things this way. And what you want, I assume what it sounds like you want me to do is say, yes, that's true, but it's deeper than that. Like right now, if I could change the political structure, change who's running the police departments, why is that not enough?
Well, it's not enough because I'm not sure how far it goes, right? And so this was some of the debate with the defund police and varying types of police reforms that were starting to make some headway. And the question was, number one, on the one side, it was great to see people standing up and city councils and mayors saying, we're going to do something fundamentally different. And that is great. It's progress. I think it's what has to and needs to be done. But what happens when that city council turns over? And you've got new people 2 years from now that get elected and a new mayor and so forth. How does this continue? And so the question is not necessarily how can we shut something down for kind of an immediate moment, but how do we do so consistently in terms of that revolutionary change? And so what I'm often pessimistic about is that that long-term type of systemic change, knowing that if we change even things a little bit in law enforcement, what will the same change happen, let's say, in the courts? And that's a fundamentally different set of actors who may or may not agree with what's going on in this other area of criminal justice. And this is where we get back to this sort of systemic nature of racism, that it's all tied together. And so if we are going to really seriously push back against it, it's got to be where racism happens and gets reproduced in education and in criminal justice and in banking and in housing and across the board. And so that's where, I don't know, people tend to say I'm very pessimistic about the future, but it is so. And, to your point, it's hard not to, in this day and age, as you said, to look around and see very specific bad actors and say, this is being, if not caused by you, certainly exacerbated by you, whether that's the head of a police department or the president of the United States, to be quite frank.
Mm-hmm. So you also pointed out that, so it's not bad actors, that's not enough. You said that it's not enough to stamp bias out of algorithms. So, but you have admitted you're pessimistic, so I hear that. But tell me what is it that I need to do? What are people, good people who want to make the system better? What should they be doing?
Well, I think number one, sort of understanding, and that's why I like the sort of the nature of where this discussion started, because I think people really have to understand the nature of racism, what it is, how it gets perpetuated. And I don't think we've really settled on that. When we think about all the stuff that's happened recently with the executive order by the president that says, we can't talk bad about the United States. We can't teach young people that the United States was, a racist country or still is a racist country, and all of these kinds of ways. I think we have to come to some terms about understanding the role of race and racism in the U.S. So I think that is one significant part. I think when we get to issues of sort of technology, race and technology, I think one of the things that is critical is thinking about the questions. So both the problems and the questions. And I always like to go back to civil rights leader Roy Wilkins, who was one time head of the NAACP and did a lot of things and was very much interested during the 60s in computers. He didn't have a lot of connection with it, but he knew that there was this new thing that had a lot of power. He recognized it was going to fundamentally reshape the labor market and the economy, and he was very interested on what that technology's relationship to Black people would be. And in 1960, he wrote an LA Times editorial that I love to read over and over and over and over again. And the title of the piece is called "Computerize the Race Problem." And ultimately what he does, he comes to the end and says, basically, look, we've said the computer, this new technology that we have, can solve problems. It can help us produce better crops. It can do all of these things. Could we ask it to help us solve our race problem? And so I think he asked that question rhetorically, but I think nevertheless, it was the question. And so what I mean by all of this is I think we have to start asking ourselves different questions about how we imagine our technology, what new technologies we should design and build, for what purpose, and whose interests they should serve. And so I think as we're thinking about building these new technologies that will serve and work for whom? Who's out asking the question, what technology that can we build today that will help us solve the inequities around race in hiring and employment? Who's building that? Who's designing that? Who's asking the question, how can we build a technology that gets us around, if it's even possible, discrimination in the housing and mortgage lending area? And so I think these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask ourselves rather than the ones that we typically do, which is, what technologies can we build that will make us the most money? And so the profit sort of motive or many others. So I think the question is an important place to start.
Okay, I'm going to be more pessimistic than you right now then. So
All right.
I'm in Silicon Valley and at Stanford, but I'll just say the idea of tech fixing racism seems absurd to me. So I want you to help me with this, right? So I've yet to see the development of broad technologies that have served to reduce inequalities. Maybe I've missed it, so I want to be open about that.
Yeah.
But because the technologies exist in a broader social system, right? And you already touched on this a little bit, like the profit motive, the way a capitalist system is designed, produces and pushes towards certain outcomes. So help me think about this. What's the positive role that tech can play, like really, like in a way that I could get behind and believe? Because right now I'm not a believer.
Well, and to be sure, I'm not either. And it's because I think there's a vast difference between what we can do and what we will do. And I think that's what you see in Silicon Valley. We can put the technology to use in any ways that we put our mind and put our capital to. That's my solution. But I think that those with power and capital have no motive, no profit motive to be sure, to design technologies whose fundamental interest and value is in fixing racism, right? People profit from racism. People profit tremendously from racism. And so I think it's hard to get folks to see long-term economic returns in a technology designed for that purpose. It doesn't mean we could not do it, right? We have the engineering power, we have the ingenuity, we know what the problems are, we know the complexity of them if you're asking the right folks to be involved in it. What we lack frequently is simply the will. And when I say the will, I'm not talking about the will of you and I, but the will of people who have access to the vast sums of wealth and capital to make technologies at scale to either create, exacerbate, or solve some of these big problems, racism being among the biggest. So whether, I think it could theoretically be done. I am pessimistic given both our present and our history that we will ever do it. But I think if we're even going to get down that road to thinking about what makes that possible, I think we have to start asking ourselves different questions. And I think those questions have to be specifically race-based questions. We can't do this, we're just going to make technology that benefits all people. Well, we know what kind of a crock that is. We know who it benefits over and over and over. When I say I'm building something to benefit everyone, well, those who already have disproportionate access to power and privilege are those who benefit from it. So thinking about technologies that will specifically help Black and Latinx communities, Indigenous communities, and start thinking about our technologies in that way, those are going to be first steps, first ways of asking different questions that could lead us to different types of technologies that we can imagine, build, and potentially deploy.
All right, we'll see. We'll see. I want to turn briefly, because we don't have too much more time, but I want to turn briefly to technology and activism. So it's certainly the case that technology, especially social media, has affected activism, sometimes called hashtag activism. And honestly, I'm mixed on this, right? So on the one hand, I see the power that technology has given to people to bring large groups of people together. On the other hand, in some sense, by reducing the barriers to communicate, it's also doesn't require the same type of commitment that you would have had without it. So I'm curious how you think about the effect of technology on people's commitment, not just their activity, but their commitment. And I'll just point out one thing. I'm going to stick with my pessimism. I think, for example, the black tiles on Instagram. Yeah, I assume you remember that when the Blackout Tuesday. Like you get those sorts of things where people feel like they are doing something and it's unclear that it has any consequence. And so there's a way in which even there where Black, brown, indigenous folks are trying to use these platforms, these technologies to organize. And even then it's not clear to me that it's beneficial. So where are you now on tech and activism?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It's a mixed bag, and I've done a lot of work with Black Lives Matter and trying to understanding both where it came from and what its impact has been. And the fact is that it has been impactful, but I'd say impactful in one particular dimension, and that is basically driving attention to a particular problem. And sometimes I say that and people, will say, well, that's not all that is. And I don't want people to misunderstand that I am dragging down in some way or diminishing the influence of Black Lives Matter, because I think, frankly, that movement in its digital incarnations and its use of sophisticated use of digital tools is what allowed them to do something that we frankly haven't been able to do since the late 1960s, which is to put racism, and particularly the relationship between Black people and the criminal justice system front and center on the public agenda. That's something we have not done throughout the whole decade of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, really up to this president. So that impact is sure, it is strong, it's necessary if we're going to ever have any kind of change. That said, I think we have seen quite a bit of the lag in terms of what that means for people who are increasingly committed over long term to this cause, participating in things that have always been the fundamentals of activism, organizing, being part of, on the ground, if you will, actions, so on and so forth. And that's, I think, where, our technology has limitations and can't be solely sort of mobilized in that one-dimensional way. And I think people know, I think activists know this. And when I was doing a lot of this work around Black Lives Matter, one of the interesting things that would often happen is activists would, I'd say something to them about, what's the power of digital media to, your movement and what you've done? And they would say nothing. They would completely dismiss and say, look, the work of activism is the work of organizing, of capacity building, of deeply working to fundamentally shape and change systems and policies and practices, and that's what they are all about. The technology is a mere tool to drive attention, but the deep work is that work of organizing. And I think that is deep and hard work, and it's not something you get folks to, in 30 seconds, retweeting an article or liking something and so forth. Sure, you can recruit folks in that way, and I'm sure it's been helpful. But I think, technology, social media platforms are not, I think, an end-all, be-all for this problem. And I think it also illustrates this sort of back and forth about the system and the way that ends up regulating itself, right? You saw this, with Trayvon Martin, with the protests that were happening throughout the Black Lives Matter in 2014, 15. You see it recently. Police department, law enforcement, FBI, they have access to social media too, right? And so as soon as I learn that this is your tool, then it's easy for me to take those tools. I've got way more access because I can compel data from tech companies or telecom companies and so forth. And I can use that to surveil, police, track, and thwart what you're trying to do in your activism. And so even to the degree that it is a tool to help activism and activists, ultimately there is that course correction. And suddenly these tools are not very effective at doing what they were for a brief moment. And so, again, it doesn't seem to be, in my mind, a panacea.
And how would you have people organize? So right now, there's a lot of energy, right? So there's people on the streets. What would you have people do if it were up to you and you were driving this and you wanted to change the setting on thermostat, or you wanted to really fundamentally alter the system? What is that people should be focusing on? What should they do?
It's a hard question. It's a hard question. And frankly, I'm of the mind sometimes in certain moods of, you got to burn things all the way to the ground before you build them up the way you want to go again. And thinking about that in ways that mean deep, fundamental structural change that comes from a lot of hard work of not only organizing, but trying to address and change laws. So it might be folks that are going into elective office because that's the way to specifically address and try to change laws on the ground. It's trying to compel people to produce knowledge and data that demonstrate and show that things are going wrong and in the wrong direction. And so I think there's a lot of things people should do. I think educating themselves about what the problems are. I think finding an organization that is deeply committed to fighting these injustices, and there are many. There are legacy ones like the NAACP, Lawyers Committee, many groups, depending on whether you're interested in criminal justice or housing or what have you. There are new ones, there are old ones. Find an organization and a group of people that can help you engage and channel your action in a very substantial way. But I think participating, engagement has to be part of the solution. But frankly, it's hard to know what to do at any given moment. And I think that's, part of the legacy of racism, of seeing and thinking and looking out on things and saying, man, this is just too damn hard to do anything about. And so going fishing.
Because man, it sounds both tough and scary. Because you say I'm talking about burning it down. Like, your life seems pretty comfortable, right? My life feels pretty good.
Right. Right.
Right. So burning it down, that's a tall order. And there are people who are even obviously better off. People would have even more resources to benefit from this as it is. Like, how do you get people to, what does that look like? How do we even start that? Are we destined? Are we trapped in this cycle of, some change as things look dire, and then we get a little bit of change, and then we see the system countering that, and then we do it all over? Are we just stuck in the cycle? That's what really struck me about your book, is that when you talk about the 60s, it looks like we're going through the exact same thing, right? If we're lucky. That assumes that there's actually some change. And you could say the same thing, you go back further, you could talk about Reconstruction. It looked similar, right? And different, there are always differences, but it looks cyclical, right? It looks like you get some fundamental change, what looks like fundamental change, and the system responds, people being what they are. And are we just in that moment? Is that what this is right now? We're in that crisis moment, and we just assume that if we're lucky, we get 5, 10, 15 years of some, incremental changes, then we're back?
Yeah, and maybe, I've become more and more comfortable with incremental change. And, pessimistic still on the fact that incremental change means that what fundamentally is still kind of persists in a way. But I think the history of, as you said, this is not new. This is something we've been fighting against for an extremely long time. And there has been significant change. There's a day when you and I wouldn't be doing what we are doing. That folks wouldn't let us, we wouldn't be equipped to, so on and so forth. So things have certainly changed, and those have been changes that have been incremental. There have been changes that have come from major moments of taking advantage of opportunities, taking advantage of people being focused on the problem that confronts us and faces us, taking advantage of moments when people's goodwill and allyship was there and ready to be marshaled to move things forward. And I think that is what we count on. We take advantage of the moment and the opportunities that we have. And, I remember back, I think it was last November sometime, it was right when the book came out, and did a book talk here at a big bookstore, The Strand, and a friend and colleague, Benjamin, who's also written a great book, several great books about the intersection of race and technology, professor at Princeton. She was gracious enough to come and be my sort of interlocutor at that event. And, we got talking about this question of optimism and pessimism. I said, Ruha, it's hard for me to be optimistic. Where do you find optimism in the challenges that we face today? And, she said something that I think has stuck with me and I think is borne out, which is the optimism comes from people who are energized and active all over the country to make a difference and making change, and they're doing so in the very little, small, or expansive corner of the world that they're working in. And I think that's what we have to hold on to, that there are people who are committed to making sure that the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 50 years are different. Many of those are young people, the kind of folks that we work in and day out. And that's where, this hope and optimism comes from. And it's hard to see down the road and say, I don't see this happening because I've never seen it happen. And it's great to talk to people who have, who have a different view, who's not quite as jaded and whose outlook of the future still shows possibility from pushing and from these kinds of incremental change. And, who'd have thought we'd be talking this year about defunding police? I didn't. Mm-hmm. That was someone else's dream, an old dream that's come across throughout the years, but no one saw it coming, I don't think, in a realistic way over the last few years. And so, things are possible, and it's good to know that things are possible, even if we can't see how we might get there.
Yeah, so that gives me a little bit of optimism, but I have to say, I still feel like we give people false hope, right? So what I mean by that is people still believe there's we're going to make it to the promised land. And I am of the belief that we can certainly make changes. Right now, as I look back, I don't know what the promised land looks like for this country, meaning that where we have truly, attained the promise that the country is purposed on, that's harder for me to get to. And I think the reason I worry about that is I think people get tired because they're expecting a finish line, right? It's we're going to make it to the point and we'll have won and it'll be over, which is different from where I think I am now, which is it's an ongoing struggle, right? There is no finish line.
Right.
It's a constant, we're not going to get to the point where it's done. It's a constant commitment to equity because the system is always pushing inequality. The system is always pushing back against that. There's no winning. What do you think about that? Is that?
Yeah. I think that's right. I think it is sort of naive to think of a promised land or a winnable goal that will be achieved in, our lifetimes, even our kids' lifetimes, and so forth. I think that what persists is the struggle, and I think that's where I would worry. When people stop struggling, that's where I worry that we can go no further. But as long as people still struggle, I'm optimistic about that incremental change, and it's never going to be enough. And it's one of those things where I look out, and it is disheartening to say the least. When I look out and say there are scores of people out in the world who effectively don't have a chance, right? In some ways, because everything we have stacked against them in terms of access to opportunity and resources and so forth. And some of them will struggle. Some of them will be blessed with parents and loved ones who struggle and help them get past that. And that's how, I got to where I am. I'm sure that's partly evident in your story as well. But there will be a lot of people left behind, as it were, in ways that there always have been. And so that's hard to stomach. But at the same token, I think seeing that change for even, a small group fraction of these groups of people, I think are, I think it's what we have to be able to hold on to. That is our sort of mirror of change, or a goal that is somewhat attainable. It's not a finish line, as you said, but it is progress. And I think that we have and continue to have the ability to make progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we certainly can make progress. And sometimes I wonder why we don't talk more to people who are in power and have a lot of enjoy a lot of benefits and privileges, in part because at moments like this, where we are now in the country, we are in this kind of cycle, it really feels to me anyway, like we're on a knife's edge, right? So the 60s didn't have to end up the way they ended up. And right now it's still up in the air how this is going to play out. I think there's in this country, there's such an assumption that things will constantly get better, that things will work themselves out, that it'll be okay in the end. And no, things don't have to be okay in the end, right? And
nope.
I wonder why we don't do more to remind people who benefit greatly from the system that they also should be wanting this to end well, not extract more and more, but figure a way that everyone can participate to at least to some extent. So I always am always a little bit confused that we don't do more of that.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's folks that are short-sighted or don't want to think about it, or don't have a sort of understanding of history enough to know that, at least when you think of it in some sense, that there are benefits to kind of progress, making sure that more people are enfranchised, more people have benefits through the system. Because, ultimately at some point, people will, get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And then where do they go? They come after the people with resources and power, because that's what they've been bereft of for so long, and that's where they come looking to take it. And so, so I think there's a way in which, helping folks, reminding folks that opening, expanding opportunity, having more folks who are able to have a lifestyle that sustains happiness, sustains having a family, sustains being able to do and have some determination over your own life and livelihood, that is positive. But as you said, there's no guarantee. And frankly, we didn't get a chance to talk much about this, but, we got an election coming that I think, if nothing says fork in the road and a decision point where we will go one direction or the other, and I tend to think this is as close to one as we've ever had, at least in my lifetime. And I'd be lying if I didn't say I'm a little bit afraid of what could be. I'm a little bit afraid for, I've got a 12-year-old son. I started to think what things could look like if things, go the direction that they're going for much longer. These things are up to us. We make the decision. We decide which way we're going to go. This is a turning point. As much as those moments in the early mid-1960s set us on a course that led us to where we are now, I think we are making and are in those kinds of times today. We're making decisions that will set the course of our future, both in terms of race and technology, for a long time to come. So it behooves us to get it right, or at least to be thinking about what the implications of our decisions are.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to leave our group with? This is a special set of people, and a lot of people who are interested enough to show up. That was
Indeed.
A pretty good ending. But is there anything else you'd want to leave the group with?
Nothing in particular. I'd say just, keep with it. People who showed up because they had an interest in these questions. And I think that interest and engagement is what has to persist. I hope there are folks on here who fundamentally disagree with what I've said or what you've said somewhere along the course. But we'll keep coming and engaging with folks, because I think that's so much of what we are missing. We talk past each other, we talk at each other, we talk against each other. We have not, in a long time, it seems, been able to talk with each other frankly and directly in ways that are, messy, admittedly. Doesn't leave us always leaving with a smile on our face or, a good feeling, but it's necessary if we're going to push through and get to thinking about how do we collectively move our society in some way that's in a better direction than where we're headed at the moment.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the time. Thanks so much for showing up and sharing your thoughts with us. It was great.
I do. I thank you as well for having me with you. This has been great, and hope everyone has gotten at least a little bit something out of it. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. For those of you listening, next time we'll talk about capitalism with Mirza Baradan. She is a professor of law at UCI and also the Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And she's the author of How the Other Half Banks and The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. So I hope you enjoyed today's session and look forward to talking with Dean Baradan on Monday. Thanks so much.